Grace Will Lead Us Home explores the aftermath of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel AME Church here in downtown Charleston and how it has changed our community. In this special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I speak exclusively with the author of the book, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter Jennifer Berry-Hawes of the Post and Courier. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Listen to this interview Friday on my free Quintin's Close-Ups iHeartRadio podcast. And as always, subscribe to this YouTube channel. Jennifer Berry-Hawes, it's so good to see you again here on Quintin's Close-Ups.
It's great to see you, Quintin.
I appreciate it greatly. Obviously, over the past, I would say, 48 hours, you are making news, obviously because of your new book, Grace Will Lead Us Home.
It's been a different experience as a journalist to be on the other side of the fence, that's for sure.
What else are you experiencing now as a book author that normally wouldn't see as a journalist?
Well, I've been able to go to some book events, which is certainly something that we don't do as journalists.
Yes.
It's been really interesting to see people's questions about the book and what they want to say about their experience often in all of this tragedy. It's certainly been different to be the person being interviewed versus the interviewer. Certainly a more comfortable spot for me, but it's been really interesting to see what kind of questions people around the country have about the tragedy that we all know so near and dear.
You talk about that tragedy. Obviously, it was the tragedy of Mother Emanuel Church on June 17, 2015. When you look back at 2015 to now, what is the biggest difference about this story in your mind?
I think that now that we've had some time go by and we've been able to really digest what happened, I think what we've seen is a much more complicated story than we thought initially. You remember that after Dylan Roof was arrested at the bond hearing,
right,
a number of the family members expressed forgiveness and mercy and love and this sort of thing. But since then we've seen that their lives have been very complicated. They've had a tremendous amount to deal with in terms of trauma and loss. But also these are very real people who have complicated feelings. Some of them have dealt with divisions with the church, within their families, difficult experiences heading toward forgiveness. It's been really interesting to see a very complex story that wasn't obvious in those first days and months. And in your book, Grace Will Lead Us Home, obviously it details about how Felicia Sanders wanted basically comfort from the leadership of Emanuel AME Church. How's that so far? Well, Felicia will still talk about how she felt her spiritual needs were not met by the leadership of the church. She wanted someone to come to her home and to counsel her on what the Bible said about tragedies like this and why bad things happen to the faithful. And she felt like she did not receive that. Now, Felicia left Emanuel and went to Second Presbyterian and has stayed there and is very close with the pastor, Chris Darwin, and feels at home there. And so while that was a difficult journey for her to leave the church and go to another church, she was able to find that spiritual comfort that she needed. Her needs obviously were tremendous. She had a lot of questions about why God had allowed this tragedy to happen, why her son died and her aunt and 7 other people. But she's moving in that direction. It's a long, long journey for someone to deal with something of that magnitude. Oh,
yes, indeed. And also, I don't know if this is true, but I know there's some friction between Sharon Richard and her family as well.
So you'll remember that Nadine Collier was was the first person to speak the words of forgiveness. Her sister Sharon wasn't ready to forgive right away. She understood that the Bible called her to do so, and she intended to do so, but it was not going to be immediate. And so there was some disagreement there with that. Their family divisions really dealt with other issues as well. And one thing that I found with this was that when families are dealing with traumatic events, every positive feeling between people is magnified, and every hostile word and every resentment becomes magnified. So one of the things I wanted to communicate was that these families are left to deal with so much. And of course, they're all working toward these ideas of forgiveness and whatnot, but it's difficult. It's difficult for any of us to forgive someone we're close to who we feel hurt by. That's not unique to them. The reason that their stories resonate, I hope, is that they're universal. We all know what it means to have fallout with people in our families who we love. Doesn't mean that we don't love them, but it means that we're angry at them, and we have to resolve that. They're no different. These are regular families who are dealing with a tremendous loss, many of them beneath an intense media spotlight, and they're not perfect, and they're trying to deal with all of this day in and day out, as the rest of us are able to go about our lives. And I wanted people to remember that they're dealing with that.
How have they been able to deal with the media attention over the past 4 years in your mind?
Some of them were much more comfortable with it than others. I think some people are just more comfortable being out public. Some people are not. I remember, for instance, Felicia is one who preferred to be more in the background. Her son, Tawanza, who was killed in the shooting, was a big personality. He enjoyed being out there. He had a real exuberance for his life and his message. And Felicia did not like speaking in front of large crowds. A lot of us can relate to that.
Right.
Jennifer Pinckney's another one.
Right.
Clemente was much more public,
Right.
and that was his role.
Yeah.
She preferred to be home with her children and working at her school, and she was thrust out into that spotlight. What I see as we approach the 4th anniversary is many of them being more comfortable in that role. 4 years have gone by now.
Right.
I think they have reached more of an understanding that there's a message that they want to spread, whether it's one of forgiveness or it's a message about their loved one, and they're more comfortable. But that isn't a path that any of them would have chosen. Some of them were more comfortable initially than others, but nobody wants to be famous on the back of a tragedy like this one.
Sure. How do you define forgiveness after this tragedy?
I think of two kinds of forgiveness. I think about individual forgiveness, which is for me and between me and God, to say, I'm not going to let hate for you corrode my soul, and I'm not going to let my malice interfere with my own salvation. But then there's a communal forgiveness,
Sure.
which to me has more to do with addressing the issue of racism, for instance, as a community. We can't just forgive and move on in that sense. We can't forgive and then not tackle the problem. And I think that's the issue we've confused, where we've too often allowed their forgiveness to give cover to people who don't want to deal with racism. And we need to do that, or the community's never going to really heal. And that's a different kind of forgiveness in my mind. What the family members were talking about was their own individual forgiveness. But we have not, as a community, done enough to address the history of our city and the racial disparities that still plague our city. We have work to do. So I distinguish between those two types of forgiveness. It was interesting to watch the city council debate the apology.
Right.
And even that became controversial. It was a narrow vote. And it nonetheless provided a step forward. But there's a lot more to be done.
How much more do we have to do as far as healing racism in this community?
I think we have a lot. And part of that is because, well, two reasons. One is that I don't think we know enough about the history of the city. Many people who live here are not from Charleston.
Okay.
And I've lived here for 20 years, and while reporting on this book, I learned a lot about the city that I didn't know. And you don't know what you don't know, so I have a lot more to learn, right? But also people who aren't from here just simply don't know, and they haven't experienced it. So I think that we need to better embrace that history and be honest about it, because it's going to be very difficult to move on until we're honest about it. One of the examples that I've used a couple of times is you would not go to Germany and hold a wedding or something like that in a labor camp. So why do we do that here in plantations? We view them so differently. Why do we view that history differently? And it's not that plantations aren't beautiful places. It's that there's a history there that we need to understand and be honest about. I don't understand how we'll move forward without doing that. The other piece in my mind is that we have tremendous racial disparities in South Carolina, whether it's in education, health outcomes, income, housing. We have to deal with those. People need to have equal opportunities. We need to have children, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, all having access to excellent schools, as an example. Until we do that, in my mind, we are going to struggle to move forward. And as of now, we haven't addressed that.
How would you write history now?
I certainly want to see that history told in equal footing so that you have a better understanding, as I mentioned earlier, of what happened. Here's an example. Denmark Vesey's statue is in Hampton Park.
Right.
Hampton Park is named after Wade Hampton,
Right.
who was himself one of the largest slave owners in the Southeast. Those two histories need to be told as part of a complete history. It's not up to me as a journalist to say how policymakers should do that. But I think that when we can have an honest conversation about that history and where we are, we'll be in a better place to move forward.
Why hasn't this conversation been honest in your mind?
It's painful. I think it's painful, and for many white residents, I think they struggle to know how to have that conversation. They're very fearful of being labeled racist if they say something that seems, quote, wrong. And it's easier to go about your business whitewashing it. An interesting story is, if you've ever read the book Denmark Vesey's Garden, there's a story in there about how the authors came to Charleston. They wanted to rent space in one of the antebellum homes downtown. And the homeowner said that the apartment was a space that the servants had lived in. And these were two historians, and they questioned her, and they said, well, do you mean enslaved people lived there? No, these were servants. So, of course, they went and did the research and found that, in fact, it was not true. But it was a perfect example of how the story has been manipulated. It's not an honest story. And I think that people avoid it because it's uncomfortable and it's painful, but you're never going to get beyond that pain if you don't walk through the valley. And we need to do that. We need to do that here in Charleston, particularly. This is the epicenter of the slave trade, and the history is rich and interesting, but yes, some of it's painful. And I think that we need to have those painful conversations so that we can move forward as a community of people who live here together and love one another and support one another. And I think we've taken steps toward that since the shooting. There certainly have been very inspiring changes, but not enough, and not enough that's systemic.
I know that obviously you're a journalist and you covered the tragedy from 2015 to now. I know you're supposed to leave out your personal feelings and whatnot, but how has your faith grown as a journalist and as a person?
Well, I would not be an honest person to say, I have the same questions. Why did this happen? Why are 9 beautiful people gone? What's the point of that? And I have to walk away saying it's because of the positive that can come out of it. I hope so. Dylan Roof wanted to reinstitute segregation. But what if, in fact, through a variety of measures, it ultimately led to more of a reunion of people? That would be my hope as a person. That's where I find hope in this story. And I think a lot of other people as well, but we have to make it happen. It's not going to happen magically. We have to put in the hard work. And I would look to our policymakers, and many churches around the community have already begun this work and have made significant strides. The Illumination Project here in town is one. The Okra Soup Dinners are another. There's a book study between Mount Zion and Grace Episcopal.
Oh, yes.
There's a number of these kinds of efforts. but we need more of that. We need to involve more people. And I would encourage more people to step up, even if it's outside their comfort zone.
Mm. You talked earlier about those stories and people that you actually, covered and really spent time with, Felicia Sanders and others. When you put aside the Mother Emanuel tragedy, which one of those folks' stories relate to you?
The one that I think I relate to the most is maybe Jennifer Pinckney. Jennifer never went to any of the hearings. She never saw Dylan Roof in person until the trial. She didn't want to. Her number one goal was to keep life as normal as possible for her two little girls. And many people don't know that she also lost her mother shortly after Clemente was killed. So she had back-to-back tragedies and loss. But she was determined to go back to work, to her library and the children there, and to keep her girls in dance and have them doing chores and homework and those normal things. And I think that I relate to that because I think that's probably how I would respond with my children, is I would mostly want to protect them. And she did a remarkable job with that. Now, they're all amazing people, and I could run through every one of their names and say something amazing about them. Felicia's faith and her determination to keep her granddaughter's life as normal as possible, very similar. I look at the adults involved and think they may have disagreements among each other, but their commitment to keeping the children safe and their lives normal is to be applauded. I really, you really, as a mother, think, how would I have reacted? What would I do for my children? And that was always the piece that really stuck out to me, was that commitment to the kids.
How committed is Mother Emanuel AME Church these days to staying really strong?
Well, the good thing is that they've had some continuity in their pastor.
Yeah.
I think they've seen some reduction in the sheer volume of visitors, which was overwhelming for a time. And it wasn't that people weren't coming for good reason. They wanted to come to offer condolences, be part of the services, and to honor the church. But I remember one Emmanuel member telling me that he found that they were spending a lot of time drying the tears of visitors and did not have adequate space and time to dry their own tears. And that always stuck with me because they were the ones who needed to heal more. And I think now they have more space for that. I hope so. I hope that they're able to find their footing in a really different new normal for the church. And I see more of that.
You talk about the church, and obviously you talked about the drop-off of visitors. How, for lack of a better word, what is the church's population now after the tragedy? Is it diverse? Is it the same?
I think it's more diverse than it was, but I don't want to overstate that it's diverse. I don't think we have many at all truly diverse congregations in Charleston. And there's that old saying that Sunday is the most segregated time of the week, and I think that's true. So it's more diverse, but I don't think I would want to overstate that. They do have a more diverse range of visitors, I'd say. Moving forward, that may change. Obviously, the anniversary always brings renewed attention, and I think churches everywhere embrace an opportunity to welcome people into the faith as they do. And so I think it's more diverse, but I think that they haven't seen quite as much diversity as perhaps they'd like, but that's not only Emmanuel. That's churches all across the state and really the country. That's part of the broader problem.
How do you fix that problem now?
Well, that problem, and maybe it's not a problem. People worship in their comfort zones, but also church traditions have grown up differently. You can go to point to Second Presbyterian. The Presbyterian Church, which is the church I grew up in, is much more staid. The music is more somber and more. The style of worship is you tend to sit more. It's just a calmer, more formal sometimes style of worship, depending on the church. And Many Black churches have grown up through a tradition of lively music and expression and call and response, so that they're just different stylistically. So some of that's just your comfort zone and what you were raised in. But I think a lot of it goes to just inviting people to join you and making sure they feel welcome in your church. I don't think we do enough of that. It's not just church. It's inviting somebody over for dinner at your home. It's asking them to grab a beer after work. It's the places where we feel comfortable. We need to make sure that we're inviting people who don't look like us. And again, that goes to stepping outside our comfort zones. We've grown too much in silos, and so we're comfortable in our silo. But I think we need to get out of some of it and meet people who are different from us. And it's not just different racially, from different socioeconomic groups, different areas of town, different faith backgrounds. We need to better know each other so that when we're, for instance, advocating for policies, we know who we're talking about. If we're advocating for policies about immigrants, we need to make sure we understand where they're coming from. And you do that by knowing people, by going out and meeting people, hearing their stories. That's one of my favorite parts of this business, is that we get to do that. Right. And we get to use the excuse of that it's for work, right? And go out and meet all kinds of people and go, to a mosque, for instance, if you've never been to a mosque, or to a synagogue, or a Christian church, or a Black church or a white church if you've never been. That's incumbent on all of us.
Buzz again. Oh, sorry. And that leads me to the next question. You just wrote the book, obviously. Grace Will Lead Us Home. What is the future of Mavi Emmanuel in your mind?
Well, I think Emmanuel will settle into a role as a stop on the civil rights tour. It's an important place like 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama, for instance. But it's going to take some time because it's a different role from being surely a place of worship. That means entertaining visitors, and it means doing tours, and they've done a lot of work to set those kinds of things up. Soon they'll have the monument, the memorial outside. People can visit and go there. So I think it will settle in. After this tragedy, the church lost much of its ministerial staff in the shooting. And then had some turnover in its pastors in that first year, you'll remember. So they couldn't do that right away. There wasn't a roadmap of how to handle this. Nobody came to the church and said, here's what you need to do. I'm actually working on a story now about how houses of worship that have been through these tragedies are helping one another to cope, but also to know what to expect next. What are some of the hurdles that you're going to have to overcome? What are some things that we did wrong that we can help you do right? So they are reaching out across those lines. But Emmanuel, keep in mind, was one of the first. We had the shooting at the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, and then there was the shooting at a couple of Jewish centers in Kansas. But really not much else on this magnitude. Sadly, we've seen more of it, which means the lessons learned here they can take elsewhere. But there wasn't a roadmap for them to follow, and so it's taken time.
In your book, "In Grace Will Lead Us Home," is there one particular person or persons that you wish you could have gotten the book that you haven't? Somebody said like Reverend Betty Dees Clark, or Reverend Goff.
I always, as a reporter, I always wish people would talk to me more, because I rarely am in a position where I say, gosh, I've just talked to that person too much. I have a complete understanding of where they're coming from. Yes, I wish, and in the case of both of them, we could hear more from them in the book, but that wasn't the case. As a journalist, you're limited to the access that you get and the information that you get.
True.
And I wanted to paint as accurate a picture as I could with the information that I had. I think that Reverend Clark did a much better job of reaching out to the survivors and the family members, and they appreciated that. That's still work that needs to be done. There are still hurt feelings out there that need to be resolved. I would love to see all of the parties at some point be able to sit down and have a conversation. Same thing within families. I like to see people resolve their differences. You mentioned Sharon and Nadine, both wonderful, wonderful ladies.
Sure.
And I hope that they sit down at some point when they're ready and are able to resolve it and have a relationship again. But these things take time. These things take time. Another person who is in the book in some ways, Dylan Roof. I didn't want to write a book about Dylan Roof, and I didn't write a book about Dylan Roof, but his family has never spoken to reporters at any length to hear from them about what it's like from the family's perspective to go through this. Someday, hopefully they'll share this story, but they didn't with me. And so I and other reporters have had to rely on court filings and other ways of getting information that's less personal. So perhaps one day we'll hear from them and understand more of the impact on their family and their view of what's happening.
I don't want you to sound biased or anything, but when you go back to "And Grace Will Lead Us Home," what is your favorite chapter in your mind?
Gosh, that's a good question. I have to say, I think my favorite chapter is actually the last chapter, because I struggled with how to end the book, because people's lives don't end because of the ending of a book. Their lives go on and on and on, and that really was the point of the book, right? So I like that I was hopefully able to capture the idea that while the trial resolved one big piece of the story to their satisfaction, Roof was found guilty, which is what all of them wanted. They disagreed about the death penalty, but they certainly all wanted him convicted and kept in prison for the rest of his life. But I wanted to capture the sense of their lives continuing, and I don't want to give away too much because I hope your viewers will read it. But the ending is of leaving the trial and moving forward in life with one of the main characters, and I like that. I like leaving people with a sense of some closure, but not complete closure.
Complete closure. The book title, "And Grace Will Lead Us Home." What else should lead them home right now?
First and foremost, their families. I think all of them depend heavily on their families, and as I mentioned, some of them have had divisions within their families. I'm thinking of Sharon, for instance. This is an example of how something like this disrupts a family. Of course, she and her sister did not see eye to eye on many things, and it wasn't just them. This was in many families.
Right.
But Sharon also became much closer with her two adult children, and so that was for her a blessing that came out of it. Now, she wouldn't have wanted that to happen this way, but she's leaned much more on them and has a very different relationship with them than she did before the shooting. So, of course, we all hope that she resolves it with her sister, but she is able to lean on them more. And I've seen that in a number of families where strong relationships. Another example, Anthony Thompson. He and his daughter are very close, and he and Denise were tremendous supports for each other. And that is inspiring to see also where people become closer as a result of something terrible. It's a positive thing. Nobody wants it to happen because of a tragedy, but it is inspiring to see those strong bonds made stronger. And in his case, that happened.
Obviously, people are going to go out and buy the book from here on out. If the Postal Courier were to write another story about this book, what will be the headline in the first paragraph in your mind?
Well, I think for the Post and Courier as an entity, the headline would have something to do with our desire to bear witness to this larger story that happened in our community. We all live here and have children in the schools here and go to churches here and synagogues, and we wanted that to be our contribution. And this book is a partnership between the Post and Courier and St. Martin's Press because it's the product of our whole newsroom. It took tremendous amount of work from reporters and editors and designers, our digital crew, everybody, to cover a tragedy of this magnitude in our community. For me individually, the headline would have something more to do with being put right now with the book coming out into a role that's really different from what I normally am in. I'm not normally the person being interviewed. I normally get to ask the questions. So it really has been an interesting exercise to answer people's questions and to think about myself, which is not really something ever I want to think about in terms of a story. I really try hard to tell stories through the eyes and ears and sights and thoughts of the people who are the subject of the stories. So it's been really different for me to be on this side of things for a little while. I look forward to going back to the other side and asking the questions again. But it's an honor to be able to be part of the story and hopefully to tell, as I said earlier, a more complete story of what happened here in our city after this tragedy occurred.
If you could go back and write about Mother Emanuel now, the first night it happened, what would you write?
Well, if I was writing a story on June 18th, 2015, now knowing what I know,
Right.
I would have been able to portray the people involved as much more fully formed, complicated people, and not only as victims and the brief bits of information that we knew about them, and the same being true with the survivors. I would have known much more about who they were and their thoughts and fears. For instance, I would have known much more about Myra Thompson. She was leading the Bible study that night for the first time and was so very prepared. It was such an exciting night for her. I would have known much more about that piece of it and what excitement she brought to the fellowship hall before she was killed, and didn't know those things at the time.
Jennifer Berry-Hawes, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
Well, thank you, Quintin. It's always great to talk with you.
You're welcome, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, you're welcome. Anytime.